Hello and a very warm welcome, viewers. You're watching To The Point with your host, Kriti Mishra. In India's fight against COVID-19 pandemic, the National Institute of Virology, Pune, has emerged as the backbone of COVID testing in labs across the country. It put out the first electron microscopy image of SARS-CoV-2 virus. The NIV has validated around 90% of the country's RT-PCR and rapid test kits and established the diagnostic test protocols for the nation. Plus, it also provides technical and scientific support for troubleshooting and quality control to government labs. It has undertaken genome sequencing from positive clinical specimens from those who survived the illness versus those who succumbed to the illness. It is also working on virus inactivation. And joining us today on the program, Dr. Priya Abraham, Director, National Institute of Virology, Pune. Ma'am, welcome to Sunset TV and thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning.
Ma'am, first and foremost, talking about the new RT-PCR kit that has been developed, which will aid in detecting different mutant strains of deadly COVID-19 virus. This truly gives us hope, especially at a time when the entire country is reeling under the second wave of COVID infections. How does this new RT-PCR kit work?
Okay, these new RT-PCR kits are modified in their primers and probes to specifically detect the mutant RNA. There are quite a few now coming into the market. And its advantage would be that if a particular variant has been found to be circulating in an outbreak, then primers and probes can be modified so that RT-PCR could quickly detect that mutant. But these mutants need to be confirmed by sequencing nevertheless. But this serves as a quick screen. If you think that there is a big outbreak and maybe all the other cases could be due to this variant, you can use this mutant-based RT-PCR assay for a quick screen, but it requires confirmation. This, as compared to whole genome sequencing provides you with the additional information of other mutations which are not detected by this particular mutant RT-PCR kit. And whole genome sequencing is the backbone of genomic surveillance. And these mutant PCRs, one cautionary note is, it may be good for the current circulating variant, but should there be a new one, then a new mutant-based RT-PCR kit will have to be made. So they're good for a quick screen in a given situation where we suspect that the outbreak is due to that variant. But there are better assays that would give more information in the form of whole genome sequencing.
All right, Dr. Abraham, a lot of us will not understand what would viral genome sequence mean. Please demystify the science behind mutations in the viral genome sequencing, and public health implications, most importantly, of the mutations in the viral genome.
Okay, so this particular virus has got, its entire genome is about 30,000 nucleotides long. It's a, and there are different regions of the genome that code for the spike protein, the envelope protein, the membrane protein, the nucleoprotein, etc., and many other important genes of the virus. Now, why genome sequencing has been scaled up is because we are trying to find out whether there are any mutations that could impact on probably transmissibility. Like, for instance, if a mutation happens that causes better binding to the ACE2 receptor, then that could facilitate better transmissibility, quicker transmissibility. Or, for instance, mutations happen in the spike protein that cause poorer binding to antibodies that are generated from vaccination or after natural infection. Then some amount of protection could be reduced. Also, some mutations are known to cause more virulent infection, and also some mutations may escape detection. But luckily, all the assays that we use today in India that are validated by ICMR all can detect the variants that we have encountered thus far, because we target multiple genes of the virus.
All right, but ma'am, there is no, sorry ma'am, you're going.
No, I'm waiting for your question.
All right. We understand there is no scientific term such as double or triple mutation of the virus. What explains this massive second wave that we've witnessed in India?
So I'll take the latter part of your question. Why do we have this massive second wave? First thing is, historically, even with other infections, a second wave has been experienced, like the major Spanish flu that we had in the past century in 1918. So second waves do happen when the immunity has waned a bit. People have become a little more lax with their, COVID appropriate behavior in the context of this particular pandemic. There was a rampant, laxity to the adoption of COVID appropriate behavior in different parts of the country. That was one reason. The second is the currently widely prevalent variant called the B.1.617. This is believed to have increased transmissibility. In fact, this particular strain is further, subdivided into 3 sublineages, and this particular variant could be also contributing to this massive surge. So when we these variants were called double and triple mutant, which is really a misnomer, because these variants actually have many more mutations on their genome, just not 2 or 3 mutations, double, triple, many more mutations, and that terminology is a misnomer.
All right. So, ma'am, just like to understand what defines the transmissibility or how much the virus is virulent. How do we get to know that?
How we get to know, one is epidemiological information. If we have a variant and it is quickly spreading through a population, it's quite likely that this variant is able to spread from individual to individual. But we also need to know whether there is COVID appropriate behavior being adopted or not, because even a strain that is not very transmissible can be transmitted if we are not observing COVID appropriate behavior. That's one. Transmissibility can also be measured in the laboratory end of things. We could have an experimental, we could infect, say, hamsters, Syrian hamsters, and we isolate the animals and keep them, each animal isolated. But despite that, if we find that the infection is spreading in animals more than the previously circulating strain, we could actually call that strain to be more transmissible. At the genome level, we could actually examine the mutant and see whether that change in amino acid is impacting on a better binding with the ACE2 receptor. That could also corroborate information that maybe this strain is more transmissible.
All right, ma'am, since we are trying to understand the science behind it, in a first, Pune's NIV has also isolated and cultured the new UK variant of SARS-CoV-2. No other country has so far reported isolation and culture of the latest UK strain. Last year also, I remember, India was the 5th country to have isolated the SARS-CoV-2 virus. What would isolation mean? What does it mean, like isolation of virus? What does it imply?
Yes, we have been quite prompt in isolating this virus. When we say a virus has been isolated, we are actually being successful in growing the virus from the clinical sample in an artificial cell culture system. So when you can do that, you then have the virus talk with you. That gives you tremendous advantage. One, to understand the virus's own pathogenicity. You can set up animal experiments. 2, you can actually test this cultivated strain against sera of individuals who have been vaccinated to see whether there is better or poorer binding. And also from last year, when we were able to isolate and successfully propagate this virus in cell culture, that gave us the ability to actually work very purposefully towards vaccine formulations. And that's when we partnered with a particular pharma and we were able to give the strain to them and they could run with it from there.
So the implications of isolation would just mean for vaccination development?
For vaccination, for interrogating the basic qualities of the virus in terms of even higher virus loads achieved in animal models would suggest it is more transmissible. Also, as I said, when you test these strains which are grown in cell culture against a sera of people who have been vaccinated, you look at the binding. If there is poorer binding of these sera with this strain, it means that the mutant is not completely getting neutralized by the vaccinated individuals' antibodies. So that is also important to know, because typically vaccine manufacturers may then decide to alter the composition of their vaccine a little so that it will have good binding with antibody.
So going ahead, do you think, ma'am, that aggressive genome sequencing of the virus that infects a person post-vaccination will be the key?
I wouldn't use the word aggressive, but typically an individual who develops infection after being completely vaccinated, 2 weeks after receiving the second dose, and if they pick up the infection, this is known as breakthrough infection. So when we have such breakthrough infections, it may be well worth to actually do the genome sequencing of that fresh infection that's happened after being fully vaccinated, just to know whether you're dealing with a variant strain, which is again not binding with the antibodies produced following vaccination. So that is why we might do genome sequencing of post-vaccinated individuals, as you have just asked me.
As we understand, ma'am, that 17 new labs would come up for genome sequencing. What is the importance of this move for enhanced spatial analysis and data?
So you know that this the Indian SARS-CoV-2 genome sequencing consortium, which is known as the INSACOG, first started off, came together by end of December with the coming together of 10 major government laboratories. And we have been collecting samples from different parts of the country. Each lab was designated to a particular geographical region of our country. And we were, analyzing these sequences. Once they are analyzed along with the epidemiological information, this information is once again shared with the district and state from where these samples came, so that further, action, contact tracing, appropriate public health response can be instituted based on the information we got from the sequencing. So by adding on 17, 18 more labs, we can actually get into a kind of hub and spoke model where a number of peripheral labs, may be feeding one major lab, so that it becomes easier to cover, virtually every district in the country. And we are also expanding in the manner of including in our network certain government and private laboratories, so that we can go on to examine breakthrough infections, reinfections, and also keep certain individuals on long-term follow-up, what we call longitudinal cohorts. What happens to their immune response? Do they pick up infections along the way? So that the whole idea is when we strengthen this network, we can get better coverage of the country and do more in-depth studies with appropriate public health action.
And as ma'am, we understand that our strategy has been based on vaccination and of course vaccinating people. How challenging is it to develop vaccine for an RNA virus like SARS-CoV-2?
Okay, if I talk about RNA viruses in general, some RNA viruses, RNA virus-based vaccines have been very effective and quite very successful. If you look at hepatitis A virus, measles, mumps, rubella, pretty good. It has not been too challenging. But RNA viruses have other challenges in the form of, some of them have tremendous genetic diversity. That means the genome sequence keeps changing. So, vaccinologists and immunologists have to keep monitoring those changes. Second, some of these viruses are also found in non-human hosts. So, it can come in from a non-human origin jump into the human species. Also, some of these RNA viruses are known to undergo recombination. So some RNA viruses truly have been challenging to develop a vaccine. And even classical examples of these are HIV, hepatitis C virus. We've not been successful with a good vaccine. Even dengue, for that matter, not very successful. With SARS-CoV-2, I think the vaccine manufacture has been overall a very successful story, where it has taken years to make a vaccine. A vaccine was made in literally 10 months. But because it's an RNA virus and because the virus is bound to undergo small mutations, vaccinologists and pharma who are making these vaccines have to be constantly vigilant to see whether we are coming up with, unusually different vaccine strain, which could impact on overall protection among those who receive this vaccine, and whether this variant would actually be neutralized by vaccinated individuals. So that has been, this is going to be keeping vaccinologists and companies who are making this vaccine busy for a time. But it is not it's not a bleak situation. It just implies that there has to be very good international cooperation and vigilance. But it's not a reason for panic or gloom and doom story, no.
All right, ma'am, I'm intrigued to know, as you're telling us, that it takes years to develop a vaccine. In India, we could develop 2 indigenous vaccines. Of course, we led this vaccination drive. How did we do that in such a short span of time?
Yes, I think even the pharma company themselves were very grateful that we could expedite things. I think, we were on a war footing. We just had to get on with what we had to do. So once we isolated the virus and we had characterized it, we did not waste time in handing over the virus to the pharma company. I'm referring particularly to Covaxin, which was made by Bharat Biotech International Limited. The Covishield, has its origin in Oxford with the help of the AstraZeneca company. But of course, Serum Institute of India has taken on the huge responsibility of making many, many millions of doses. So when I come back to Covaxin, we handed over this virus strain to them. They were quick in inactivating it, giving it back to us for retesting in terms of to check whether it is truly inactivated, checking out its genetic makeup, examining it once again under the electron microscope, using immunoelectron microscopy, or looking at its antigenic and immunological features. And then we didn't waste time. We went on to preclinical studies in animal species, and that was the need of the hour. But one thing I think which serendipitously helped was that, in the past, we would have to arrange these meetings where, virologists and members of the pharma, other policymakers, everybody had to meet. There's a physical meeting. This is all done sitting in my office, and we are networking every day. Meetings can happen every day. There's no time lost in, traveling to a place. MOUs are exchanged electronically, and so that also helped, because this physical traveling, meeting, and, it's more time consuming. That also helped. And of course, we clearly knew we were on a mission. So we were able to actually do the best that we could.
Probably that digital shift has been the biggest benefit of this virus. But ma'am, moving on, by the end of June, India's daily COVID testing capacity will be up to 45 lakh. And out of these, 18 lakh will be RT-PCR tests, while 27 lakh will be rapid antigen tests. What are the reasons to scale down RT-PCR tests? It is considered the gold standard.
Okay, so yeah, that I think that has been a misunderstood, change in recommendations. We must understand we are still in the middle of a massive second wave, and this has caused an overwhelming of our hospitals. It's also caused an overwhelming of our laboratories. Many of the laboratory staff themselves are absentees because they picked up the infection. So labs have been reeling with the load on them, leading to delays in providing that, doing the test and providing the results, which is impacted on our citizens who don't get the result in time to gain admission into a hospital, especially symptomatic and fairly sick individuals. So with a view to expedite this whole testing process, antigen kits have been, the increased use of antigen kits has been authorized because in symptomatic individuals, the chances that you would truly pick up infection, the sensitivity is increased in somebody who's frankly symptomatic. That reduces time, it reduces burden on labs, and individuals can quickly be attended to when they reach the hospital. So it's not that with a view to damn RT-PCRs. No, RT-PCRs still continue to be the gold standard. But given this crisis situation, the antigen kits have been are being used because of the paucity and the overwhelming of resources in the present situation we are in.
All right, ma'am, beyond COVID, what are the other diseases or areas we've seen benefiting from genome sequencing?
So genome sequencing can be done, one, when you're doing this genomic surveillance to look at whether you are developing new strains of the virus. And typically the strains which are, the viruses that are monitored in that manner are the influenza viruses, the avian influenza viruses, because they can undergo massive changes sometimes. So they are constantly being examined genomically as well. Then, many of the, like for instance, chikungunya virus, it was very rampant in the 60s and 70s. And then it seemed to have, ebbed. And suddenly there was a reemergence in 2006. So when you have a reemergent strain or a completely new virus like this particular virus, the SARS-CoV-2, you need to monitor its behavior, and that's where genome sequencing is very important. There are other situations where you want to monitor the genome, particularly in the context of drug resistance. So like for instance, HIV is a typical infection where you are checking the genome to see whether when people are using antivirals for HIV, are they developing drug resistance? In which case, one has to take a call whether you want to change the antiviral or add on other antivirals so that the benefit is, gained from giving those antiviral drugs to the person who's infected. So genome sequencing has not just kicked into action because of SARS-CoV-2. It's been in place for a while as part of surveillance, as part of understanding whether some mutation has caused a change in its pathogenicity, to understand drug resistance, mutations, etc.
All right. Lastly, ma'am, you joined NIV in 2019, 2020. The pandemic struck us. How has been the journey so far? Because as we understand that NIV has been the backbone of India's fight against the pandemic.
The journey has been very eventful, and I'm putting it very mildly, but it has been very eventful. But I have enjoyed the support from ICMR headquarters and really the support from many of my scientists here. I believe if we have been able to deliver, it's a story of teamwork. teamwork from all quarters, not just the scientists, the staff here in the director's office, the administrating staff, the staff who take care of all the administrative affairs, the technologists, the security, the housekeeping staff, all of them. I mean, they all have risen to the challenge that this institute has been, been facing ever since the start of this pandemic. So I think if we've risen up to the challenge, it's teamwork, teamwork, and teamwork.
All right, Dr. Ibrahim, you joined us. Thank you so much for talking to us, and all the best for your future endeavors.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on your show. Have a good day.